Well, welcome everyone. Today we are very honored to have a keynote address by Barry Smith. Barry is the director of the National Center for Ontological Research. He's also Julian Park Distinguished Professor of Philosophy, Professor of Biomedical Informatics, Professor of Computer Science and Engineering, and Professor of Neurology at the University at Buffalo in Buffalo, New York. So today we're going to hear him speak on command and control. Barry?
Thank you, Ken. So I'm going to start with a short video. It really is very short. The relevance of the video will become clear later, but here it goes. Today I'm going to be talking about command and control. The bird song that you just heard are going to illustrate a very important fact, which is going to steer me through what follows, which is that control comes before command. So the correct title for this talk should really be Control and Command, which sounds somehow unnatural, but which is in fact doing more justice to the order of development in evolutionary history. Now, the person who first explored control in the sense that we're interested in it in a serious way, I believe, was Karl Bühler, who was a member of the Gestalt psychology movement on the fringes, but he was central to what was then called the psychology of thought processes, Denkpsychologie, but which we now probably would call cognitive science. And he was one of the founders of psycholinguistics. He was, incidentally, supervisor of Popper's PhD, but he had many other famous students. And so his influence is quite strong in not only in linguistics and psychology, but also in sociology and behavioral biology. And Bühler's idea is that language is embedded in behavior. So he was one of the first authors to talk about speech acts. And in fact, he was one of the first authors to use the term speech act in his writings. And then language has three fundamental dimensions. First of all, there's an innate dimension. So all human beings are born with the innate capability to learn a language, and also with certain innate capabilities, for instance, to acquire the use of the past tense or plurals and so forth. But of course, they don't have an innate capability to speak Italian or German or Greek. They have to learn a specific language. And one important dimension of everything I say in what follows is the dimension of training or drill. And this is supplied by mothers, siblings, peers, and so forth, television. This is an inevitable complement to the innate capabilities with which humans are born. And then there are two types of behavior, which we find already in, for instance, nightingales, and illustrated by the brief clip earlier, that these are expression on the one hand, which is what the baby birds are doing, and control, which is the main topic of what comes next. So these birds are sending out an auditory signal, and they're doing this for several reasons. So they are announcing a need to the parent or parents who are going to bring the food. They're announcing a location and providing guidance for the parent to find them again. They are out-competing each other or trying to out-compete each other. And this is a very neat evolutionary trick to make them scream as loud as they possibly can. Because the ones who scream loudest are the ones who have babies. And so gradually the ones who can't scream are eliminated from the gene pool. But all that they are doing can be put together in one single function, which is begging. And begging is a way of controlling the parent. What the parent does is totally in the hands of what the babies want. and what they express as what they want. The parents are functioning entirely innately. The babies are functioning entirely innately. The only thing which is new here is the begging function, which is switching the right switches on the side of the parents to make them bring food. So this is control. Now, it's not language. What we have in the case of the nightingales is not language. It's something which involves audiovisual signals. So we can think about what the most primitive language might be. And Wittgenstein, who was a contemporary of Bühler's in Vienna, although they almost certainly never met, Wittgenstein has this idea of what might be one possible complete primitive language, which is the language on a building site where we have a builder and an assistant, and the builder says slab, and the assistant brings a slab, and so it goes. This is a similar language to the language we find in a surgical theater, where the surgeon says scalpel, and the nurse brings a scalpel. So this is a kind of language. And here again, we have multiple functions, but they're all unified under a single heading. It's control all the way through. That's the only thing the language does. Now, actually, there is some similarity between Wittgenstein's account of this primitive language and Bühler's account of control, which was first identified in this paper by a long-standing collaborator of mine. And the paper describes the theory of language developed by Bühler, which he called the organon model. And it has three components: the sender, the receiver, and the state of affairs in the world which the sender is representing and which he wants the receiver to represent. This is different from the more popular semantic triangle, which has three components, which are symbol, concept, and referent. There's no real room for concepts in Bühler because he wants this to work for what we might think of as imageless or conceptless thought. But what there is the sign and the sound phenomenon in the case of auditory communication, which are illustrated here in the middle. Everything else is concrete, or anyway, it's concrete in the beginning, but it gets abstract as time goes by. So in the nightingale, we only have two components. We have the sender and the receiver. And there's control effected from one side to the other. And there's control affected from the builder to the apprentice in Wittgenstein's case. Now, Bühler adds to this organon model what he calls the two-field theory. On the one hand, there is deictic communication, which involves pointing or something similar to pointing, because you're dealing with entities which are within the visual or auditory field of both the sender and the recipient. Language allows a second kind of communication, which we call symbolic communication, which relates to everything else in the universe, the whole universe. I just referred to the whole universe by using a piece of symbolic communication in the beginning of this sentence. Now, this means that we can effectuate control in two ways. First of all, through deictic representation, where Boris tells his audience to come and take this brick by pointing to it and holding it in his hand and showing it to the audience, and then thereby asserting deictic control over the audience. They all want to come and get his brick. I'm making up this story, by the way. And this is the symbol that he's using in order to emphasize this pointing expression effectuating deictic control. And then a second case, which is symbolic control. Boris wants somebody in the audience to bring him a fly ash clay brick. And to do that, you might use a symbolic chart of different kinds of bricks and compare the chart to the bricks that you have available and then bring one of those bricks. It doesn't matter which brick you bring, so long as it is of a certain type. Such activities are possible for human beings. They are the basis of language, and they are impossible for non-human animals. Symbolic representation is what is new. So this is the two-field theory. I'm just summarizing it now. And, well, you can see that the symbolic field can allow us to use language to relate to what happens in the future. This is what makes planning possible, to what happens in some remote spatial region, which we are not now present in, so we can plan our holidays in Mallorca, for instance. But then there is an abstract realm, and this is the realm that we make. Now, Bühler was not so interested in this abstract realm, but the beginning of his discussion of the abstract realm lies in his account of group behavior. And for Bühler, it's group behavior which is responsible for the origin of language. So human beings needed language because human beings started certain sorts of group behavior which were organized. So organized group behavior is what is responsible, according to Bühler, for the origin of language. And we can see some examples here. Planning for the next harvest is an obvious one, but also hunting and so forth. And why is language needed here? Because what is needed is mutual control. Bühler often used the word steering for control. Mutual steering of the behavior of different members of the group. Now, this is easy in the deictic case. You can push your apprentice around, take him by the ear and point to a brick and pull him towards the place where the brick needs to be deposited. You don't need language for that. You can use violence. But when you're dealing with the goals which involve objects and states of affairs which lie beyond the deictic field, then you have to use symbols. And that's why symbols, symbolic language, that is to say, language, began to exist. But now symbols are not enough. Symbols are really difficult. No animal can cope with symbols, but humans, all humans cope with symbols. And that's because our ancestors who were unable to cope with symbols did not have as many children as those who could cope with symbols. And that's why we have an innate capacity to learn language. But then we have to learn a specific language. We have to learn the codes of the people we are living with. And for that, we need training, continuous training. So even when we're adults, we're constantly being trained into the correct or appropriate use of language. And the training involves sanctions if we misuse language. Sometimes we misuse language by using it incorrectly. Sometimes we misuse language by using it too correctly, and then we're punished because we sound too pompous. And this is a constant fine-tuning of language among all the people around us. Sometimes we speak multiple different languages because we mix with different crowds. And all of this is possible because language depends on training. And note that this is a very important Bühler point, and the more recent speech act theorists did not really emphasize this point because they were interested in the philosophy of language. Bühler was interested in the biology of behavior. And so what he emphasized was that as we learn language, we also learn the behaviors associated with those uses of language, including strictly linguistic behaviors such as promising, but then also non-strictly linguistic behaviors, which are illustrated, for instance, by football hooligans at a football match who shout rough things about the Liverpool football team while at the same time defending themselves against the attacks, the physical attacks of fans of the Liverpool football team. So behavior and language are interrelated. And we see this also in cases like airline pilots who learn a special language, which they use when they are piloting their planes, or terrorists, for instance, Islamic terrorists, who use a special language when they are performing their terrorist acts. Okay, now, John Searle, of course, is the most conspicuous of the latter-day speech act theorists, and he has explored the created world, the world that we create by speaking. And this is the world of claims, obligations, rights, and so on. And Searle says that these entities exist because we represent them in language. And that's correct. What Searle does not talk enough about, in my view, is the behaviors associated with these things, which are learned as we learn language through the same processes of training and sanction. All right, so these are all speech acts, marryings, promisings, and each one of these changes the world. But there are various background conditions which have to be satisfied, which were identified already by Austin. So you have to, when you're marrying, you have to use the right ritual phrases. You have to have a legitimate authority. Everyone has to be sincere in their intent. And the addressee, the wife who is being asked if she commits to the marriage, has to accept the marriage. She has to say, I do. And they have to speak a common language. Everybody has to understand the language in which the ceremony is being held. And sometimes, of course, two languages might be used to make sure that both parties are understanding the details of what is taking place. When the priest declares the couple man and wife, then he performs a speech act, and the world, according to Searle's view, changes instantaneously. But now we're not interested in that instantaneous change. We're also interested in how this marriage bond between two people is sustained in existence. So the initial creation can indeed take place just by speech acts or by other evanescent phenomena such as handshakes. And in a small community, in a village, memory is enough. Everybody remembers that Jack married Mary. And so Jack remains married to Mary forever, because if Jack behaves badly in the village, then he will be sanctioned. But if you're dealing with a larger society where people move around a lot, memory doesn't work. And so the next important component in this presentation is documents. So when you're in the larger society, it's documents which preserve created entities like claims and obligations. They preserve them in existence. And that's why we have paper contracts, why we have registry offices, why we have magistrates, why we have written plans. The existence of these things documents the beginning to exist of the claim or the obligation or the commitment, but then it sustains the claim or the obligation or the commitment in existence over time and allows the original contract to be checked, for instance. Now, Searle, in his book, Making the Social World from 2010, uses on the cover a very interesting example of all of this, which is again the case of marriage. What sustains marriage in existence? Well, in part, it's the marriage contract. It's the certificate. This is Elvis Presley's marriage certificate, or that is what I learned from the internet, at least. And this contains what Searle would call a standing declaration. A declaration is normally something which is associated with the Speech Act. Searle says that you can associate declarations also with documents. And this document contains the phrase, join in lawful wedlock. So Elvis Presley joins in lawful wedlock to Priscilla Ann Beaulieu. This means that as soon as the certificate is signed, this relation of lawful wedlock obtains between these two people. Now, this is another standing declaration. It's not from New Jersey. It's from the island of Jersey. It's on the Jersey £5 note, which is always, and as a matter of necessity, identical in value to a British £5 note. It's signed by the treasurer of the States of Jersey, who promises to pay the bearer £5 on demand. Now, the nature of this promise is unclear. I'm using it here solely to illustrate the idea of a standing declaration, which is how a document preserves something in existence over time. In this case, something like the value of a piece of paper. All right, now, documents too, all by themselves, are not enough to guarantee sustainability of value or whatever else it might be. What we need further, again, is training. So when you become a lawyer, you spend 6 years or however long it is becoming trained in how to use documents, how to understand documents, but also how to use documents. And the same applies in other spheres, wherever documents are important. Nowadays, wherever paper documents, but also digital documents are important. So this view that the world of created entities is maintained in existence by documents is now being transformed because digital documents are taking over from paper. And now we get to command and control. So as I think most of you know, the Army has a command called TRADOC, the Training and Doctrine Command. Doctrine is a set of documents which is used as the basis for training the Army so that the soldiers in the Army at different levels can perform certain acts, speech acts on the one hand, but also acts of other kinds, including commanding acts on the other hand. And the Army doctrine hierarchy is a hierarchy of publications. So TRADOC makes the Army. So the Army is a created entity, just like a marriage or a bond of wedlock is a created entity. And the Army, of course, takes a lot more effort to sustain it in existence. And that's what TRADOC is for. So it designs the Army by changing the plans which will hold of it in the future, particularly, of course, the plans for training. But these are also then manifested in the way the plans for training, the rules for training, are documented in the corresponding planning and training documents. And then TRADOC builds the Army by isolating the people who are good enough to serve in the Army, and then isolating the subgroups of that group who are then going to be developed into becoming leaders of the Army. And all of this is taking place continuously. Just as we are creating and preserving language continuously, so TRADOC is creating and preserving the Army continuously. It never ends. And this is not just true of the Army. All military services are subject to joint doctrine, of which Army doctrine is logically subservient. And this is the joint doctrine hierarchy, which again includes more general publications at the top, and then more specific publications down as you get into the collection of publications that you see here before you, each one of which points to a PDF file. One of them points to a dictionary. And the dictionary is designed for human beings. It's a dictionary in the sense in which Webster's dictionary is a dictionary. And of course, there's a problem because nowadays the Army is employing not just human warfighters, but also all kinds of computational digital artifacts. And that there is an issue about how we will extend doctrine to apply to those artifacts also. So military doctrine is there to establish the common ways of accomplishing military tasks, the common rules, the common plans, and so forth, thereby facilitating readiness. You train and plan all the warfighters so that they are ready to follow commands of specific types immediately because they've been drilled. And those Lego bricks of activities that they can perform are used in the plans so that the plans will require of the troops exactly those actions in which we have been drilled. So doctrine is a guide to action, drilling people so that they can perform some actions, many kinds of actions which interlock like Lego bricks automatically and instantaneously. Just as we perform those acts which are innate automatically and immediately. The swallowing action, for instance. There has to be no hesitation. And of course, the reason for this is because when the war starts, you can follow the plans in the initial way because you have not yet met opposition. But you need this spontaneous and automatic ability to follow commands also when the orchestrated part of the war breaks down and you confront unanticipated obstacles. There you need to be able to accept new commands which didn't fit into the plan, but which still rely on your troops being trained to follow those new commands spontaneously and automatically. All right, so the doctrine hierarchy contains a dictionary, Doctrine Pub 1-02, and the dictionary is made for human beings. So if you can see on the left, it looks like Webster's dictionary. But for computers, we built the Joint Doctrine Ontology, and you can see a small fragment of it here. The blue at the top are BFO terms, and the blue further down are terms from the Common Core Ontology, which was created by Kubrick here in Buffalo to address the needs of large military organizations to have a very, very broad scale ontology to support interoperability of military software. Just as the Joint Doctrine Dictionary supports interoperability of human actions, human systems, so the Joint Doctrine Ontology and the Common Core Ontologies are there to support interoperability of machines. And then the idea is that because the Joint Doctrine Ontology is built to be logically identical to the dictionary which underlies Joint Doctrine for humans, then the way in which the machines operate will be compatible with the way in which they are supposed to operate if they follow Joint Doctrine. All right, this is another example. The process is a BFO term, and then activity is a Joint Doctrine term, and then there are various kinds of activities such as operations, and one important set of activities is control. And here is where we get the relation then between documents and control, and very soon we're going to get the relation between command and control. All right, so the Army profession. Army Doctrine Reference Publication number 1. This is how TRADOC builds the Army. So the Army profession involves instilling in the people selected to join the Army 5 essential characteristics: expertise, honor, trust, esprit de corps, and long-term responsibility. So this means responsibility for things like veterans. And it all starts with something which is a speech act. And we'll see what this is in a moment. Making the Army professional rests not just on training, but also evaluating, testing. And then those people who pass the test enjoy credentialing. And then they're assigned to various tasks which are appropriate to their credentials. And then their realization of those tasks are evaluated, and the cycle begins again. So there's a constant cycle, which is a cycle of promotion, of medals, consisting of sequences of evaluation, action, evaluation, command, evaluation, and so forth. And the people who've passed the tests, who passed the evaluation, are promoted. And now I'm just going to check whether there are lots of activities on the chat. No, so I'm going to keep going. The TRADOC is responsible for making the Army professional on the basis of Joint Doctrine, so that soldiers will coordinate spontaneously when acting in relevant circumstances. Now, I said that we would get gradually to command. Now, there are speech acts, which are what happens when the commander issues a command, but this is a document act. The symbols here are parts of a language. which other people can understand, other people who need to understand them. And the stripes on the shoulder and the stars on the lapel are all documents which are understood by the people who need to understand them, so that the relevant speech acts by the person who's wearing the relevant uniform will have the relevant deontic effect. And then this is the code to understand these documents. And on the right, we have the way in which the army is organized in such a way that we can see the command hierarchy from one level to the next and all the way down. And this starts, as I say, with speech acts, with a specific kind of speech act, namely an oath. And the oath has the structure of the promise. So the oath is to affirm, support, and defend the Constitution of the United States. This is a promise, and this is the ontology of promising, which we're going to use as the basis for understanding the ontology of command. We will see that command is, ontologically speaking, the other side of the coin from promising. So the promiser is a person, the promisee is a person, the promise is an act, and it depends simultaneously on the promiser and the promisee. The relation is a one-sided dependence relation. You can't have a promise without a promisee. And the promise itself has a complex internal structure. It consists of an act of speaking, an act of registering, and a certain content, which is the content of what the promiser promises to do. And the act of registering is needed because the promisee has to register, and not necessarily overtly or explicitly, but by his registering, consent to the thing which the promiser wants to do. You can't promise to kill somebody unless there are very special circumstances. And there we have a case of three-sided mutual dependence. So that particular content is not just the content of a sentence, it's the content of that specific ritual act of speaking, accompanied by an act of registering by the promisee. And then immediately, two things come into existence: the obligation on the side of the promisor and the claim on the side of the promisee. And what we have here is a two-sided dependence. You can't have an obligation without a claim, and you can't have a claim without an obligation. And then we have the felicity condition. For this to be a promise rather than a sham promise, the promiser has to sincerely intend to do F. And another felicity condition is trust. And there are background felicity conditions. For instance, the promiser has to use the same language. He has to have the required expertise. It has to be possible for him to perform the act and so forth. And the promise gives rise immediately, not just to an obligation and a claim, but also to a tendency to realize the thing which was promised. For instance, mowing your lawn. And that thing has to be done by or arranged by the promiser. Now let's look at command. It looks very similar, but it is in fact a mirror image. Here, in the promise, the promiser has the obligation. Here, the commander, the executor of the act of commanding, the speaker has the claim, and the commandee has the obligation. And here the felicity condition, the prime felicity condition, is authority. The commander has to have authority over the commandee. This trust may be involved in commanding, but it's not the central felicity condition. And the sincere intention also has to be there. And if we have time, we will talk about what that means. But the sincere intention in the promise is, and the trust in the case of the promise, are much more central. In the case of the promise, the one who promises does the act. In the case of command, the one who commands, the one who is commanded does the act. And so the obligation is also a duty. And then in the case of commanding, you have what is very rare and perhaps impossible in the case of promising, which is collective commands. This is possible, but then also inherited commands, commands which flow down a plan hierarchy. So plans consist of subplans and sub-subplans, and the command involves subcommands which are themselves the result of duties on the part of subordinate commanders who have to follow the major command by performing subcommands to their commandees according to this hierarchy. Now, this is very similar to what happens in an orchestra. There you have the orchestral score, which is the plan followed by the conductor, which is the ultimate commander in the hierarchy on the previous slide. And then the individual performers have their subplans, which are the staves for the separate instruments. And this illustrates modularity of planning, which is illustrated both in the musical case and in the military case on this slide. And here again, we find the hierarchy of different levels of expertise and different levels of training, which we saw in the slides relating to TRADOC and in the slide relating to how to decipher the symbols, which are the lapel stars on the uniforms of the commanders involved in some military mission. And this is how control flows down. This is by now obvious. Each one of these steps involves the realization of specific elements of a plan at the first level, a subplan at the second level, and a sub-subplan at the third level. And so this modularity is present also in the case of the orchestra. So each group of instrumentalists forms a module corresponding to the elements illustrated here. And modularity is a necessary presupposition for massive shared agency. You remember that we began with Bühler's idea that language came into existence because of organized collective action. Organized collective action requires language. Massively organized collective action requires language which is trained for specific submodules, which means specific subgroups of people who are organized in a hierarchy. And then in both cases, the massively organized agency is possible because of training. And now this training is in many cases more properly described by using the word drill. So to learn to play a musical instrument means drill over years. And this drill continues when you learn to play a musical instrument as part of an ensemble, a chamber ensemble, or a whole orchestra. You have to be drilled in performing your action in such a way that it's synchronized with the actions of all the other instrumentalists. And this exactly the same applies where the planners in the military are orchestrating a mission. This goes on hand in hand with the presupposition that you have troops which have been drilled in the relevant actions, but also where you have troops who have been trained in the relevant mission, which corresponds on the orchestral side to the relevant symphony. And this is how to do things with documents. So you use the score to rehearse the orchestra. And you couldn't rehearse without scores and the sub-scores for the instrumentalists. And you can't perform without either having so many rehearsals that they all know the score off by heart, or by having the score in front of the instrumentalists. So drill and documentation complement each other very nicely here. You can have one without the other, but you don't have anything without either one or the other. And the same is true in the military case. So a joint mission is rehearsed and all its subplans are rehearsed. And the mission itself cannot exist without those rehearsals. And the mission itself can't be performed without rehearsals specific to this particular plan. But then there are differences, of course. So C2 in the military has a much longer chain of command. And C2 in the military involves an enemy. And there are no enemies, very rarely are there enemies in orchestral performance. And so you orchestrate a war, but you never compose a war. You compose a symphony and then you orchestrate it. All right, now the final topic I'm going to talk about very briefly is the difference between a plan specification and a plan. So if you read a recipe in the recipe book, you may do that for fun with no intention of ever cooking. But typically, you read the recipe in order to realize the plan which the recipe specifies. The plan then exists in your head when you decide to cook this particular dish. So the plan specification is a document. The plan itself is a disposition in the minds of its realizers. And now I'm not going to say very much, but that distinction underlies the joint planning process. And I'll just go through it. So we know that we're going to need to invade Iraq. So we analyze the mission. This is all performed by the staff of the relevant commander. And then there is what is called course of action development, which means developing alternative plan specifications. And then you test these plan specifications. You war game them. You run tests in the field. And then you compare the results. And then the general approves one particular course of action. And then we cease to, at that stage, we have plan commitment, course of action commitment. At that point, the plan begins to exist in the general's head. And then immediately the staff and the subordinate commanders also acquire the corresponding subplans in their heads. No longer just plan specifications, no longer just documents, but actual dispositions to act, to command subordinates, to control subordinates in order to realize the plan. And that is then the end of what I'm going to say. And thank you all very much. And now I hope you're still there. Let me see if I can. Good. And now I'm not sure if I pause share, maybe I can see a bigger screen.
I have a question.
Please.
I have worked in the space business for a long time, vaguely related to military, but not exactly. And everybody likes the metaphor of Legos. And the problem is it's really, really wrong. Legos fit together in only one way. All of the other components and conditions fit together in multiple ways, and trying to think of them fitting together as Legos is a really bad idea. Says me.
So I agree with you, actually. I think probably I will not use the Lego analogy anymore, but just for the sake of argument, and this truly is just for the sake of argument, I would note, first of all, that Legos fit together in multiple ways. So when you buy a Lego brick set, you're not restricted to make just one item. You can make many items. So it's not quite as bad as you make it sound. Secondly, in the military, they have something called the Joint Universal Task List, and then they have the Army Universal Task List. These are what I had in mind when I talked about Lego bricks. In light of your question, I would agree with you that they are to be fitted together not in the way that Lego bricks fit together. It's much more complicated and much more messy than that. But I would maintain the idea that to make the army work, you have to divide things up into small task units. Otherwise, you can't train, you can't test, you can't evaluate, you can't war game, you can't do any of the things that the army has to do to train its troops.
Agreed.
So I think we're agreed, and I promise not to use the word Lego again.
Well, it's a metaphor that everybody understands. so I know why it's used.
Yeah, yeah, but it's not, it is indeed misleading. As I think about how the juttles and the outals are used, they're never used in the way that Lego bricks are used. There's always a lot more going on.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. I love the notion that there's a strong link between language and behavior, and you said a lot about the training of behavior. As I'm watching my grandchildren grow up, and we've got 1-year-old and 2-year-olds, it seems play actually is a big component of learning behaviors and learning language. And I actually believe in the military play plays something. That's why there are war games. It's a play kind of thing. So I wonder, I'm just curious from your philosophy, because training and drilling is about taking a language and really taking a behavior and language and refining it. But what's the purpose in your larger construct of play?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. One of the areas in which Karl Bühler was very influential was in the study of child behavior. And his wife, Charlotte Bühler, was actually a world famous child psychologist. He published a number of important works in child psychology, and they both lived in America at the end of their lives. So they survived the Second World War, and she lived a very long life. I think she died in the 60s. And I was, as I say, very influential. Now, the role of play, I think the first thing to be said is that boys play hard. They fight. They run risks. They run to the edge of cliffs. And this is an important evolutionary. This is an innate tendency on the part of boys, and it's important from the evolutionary point of view. What they're doing when they do that is testing and discovering their limits, and making it the case that they push themselves in their behavior to their limits. And then the ones that push themselves too far die, or anyway, they get injured. Right. They are subject to evolutionary obstacles thereafter. This is an evolutionary brilliant device to make sure that men come out as strong and as ambitious and as gritty as they can. I'm getting carried away here. Now, play otherwise is clearly initiation for following rules. So that we play not only the dare games that boys play, that I dare you to jump off this cliff. That is not a rule-based game, but then card games and board games, they are, I don't think that that's going to be innate, although I'm willing to be corrected here. But it's certainly something which plays an important role in allowing children then to learn how to follow more important kinds of rules. For instance, when they join a large organization and there are company rules that they have to follow. And so again, another question that would be interesting to consider is the role of video games in a child development, and whether it has the same sort of positive role that more old-fashioned board games have. And I don't know the answer to that question, but it would be an interesting question to explore.
I agree. Thank you.
There's a quote from a movie, The Talented Mr. Ripley, where I think it's Gwyneth Paltrow says, "Why is it that when boys play, they always play at killing each other?"
Well, now we know.
Yeah.
I have a question. This is Mitch Coker. So your representation of commanders and commandees reminds me like the pattern of client and server in computer science. And so the question is, I can see that a commandee becomes a commander at the lower level. So how do you model this in the ontology practically? Because like in like in the client and server, there is sometimes when you want to move a system from client server to peer-to-peer, all of a sudden you need a different class peer.
Yeah.
So do you need something like this in your ontology or not?
Yeah, so BFO deals with cases such as this by using the term role. A role in BFO is something which is assigned to an entity, and the entity itself continues to exist. It just has a new role. And so the commander has the commander role at a certain time and in a certain situation, but then at a later time and in a different situation, he has a commandee role. And it's the same person all the way through, just two different roles. Now, what we're going to have to do, and this is the interesting next step, and I have to confess that BFO is not, it has not been tested here, whether this can work. But what we have to do is to describe the authority relations, on the one hand, between the commander and the commandee, but then also the obligation relations. I have authority over you, therefore you are obliged to follow my commands. How we model this obligation is still a work in progress in the BFO community. We need it in order to have a BFO conformant ontology of law, for instance. But we also need it to have a BFO component ontology of everything which is involved in a hierarchical organization, which is something that we are working on at the moment.
So it's interesting that you mentioned now situation. So finally, it's very closely related to this conference.
Yes.
So the question is, do you have a notion of situation in your ontology?
Yes, so that is indeed an interesting question. I'll be talking a little bit about this tomorrow at is it tomorrow when we have the workshop? I'm going to talk about the way in which BFO will start to deal not merely with the counterparts in the world of nouns, but also with the counterparts in the world of sentences. And to do that, I need to talk about situations. I have a respect for the situation calculus, but the situation calculus will not work, and I will explain why it will not work for our purposes.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Gabriel Jacobson. I'm here.
Hello.
Your presentation had a kind of two parts. One is a kind of Bühler's psycholinguistic theory of language, and second part was about the command and control language and speech acts in army. So I do have two questions, or maybe questions, comments. One is regarding the Bühler's psycholinguistic theory. You looked on language mostly as an instrument of communication. At the same time, during evolution, the language had also different role in terms of language for internal reflection of the reality. So, in other words, kind of thinking. So, do you think so that these two roles of language as an instrument of communication and instrument of reflection played an equal role, or there was a kind of prevailing on one of them?
Now, that's a very interesting question. It throws light on my thought processes in putting this presentation together. I was pushing towards command and control, which is the almost the paradigm example of language for communication in a big and powerful way. You're not merely trying to communicate, you're trying to communicate in such a way that you exert control of a very strong sort. And now Bühler tended to emphasize the relationship between language and group behavior. In other words, language used in communication. In his earlier psychological work, he was associated with a group of people which were interested in the phenomenon of languageless thought. And but now what you're interested in is languageful thought, which is not a matter of communication. Now, Bühler was to some degree influenced by Husserl, who was the founder of phenomenology, whose whole theory of language was based upon solipsistic monologue. So for Husserl, that's where you start. That's the paradigm example of language. And that leads to a view of language used for communication, which sees communication as a kind of secondary, subsidiary effect. And I'm a big fan of Husserl and I'm a big fan of Bühler. I think in this respect, Bühler is correct. Communication came first. Thought using language was only possible because people had already been trained, drilled, had language beaten into them in such a way that they could also use it for rather strange kinds of things. For instance, private thought, prayer, writing poetry, and other sorts of activities which have nothing to do with group survival, with organized group behavior in the service of survival and reproduction. So I don't know whether that answers your question, but it tells you something about Bühler.
Actually, I have a very short follow-up question to the previous question. Just happens to be that I more or less equally actively speak 3 languages. And just happens if I am doing something myself and later on trying to find a question in what language I actually was thinking, I have a very hard time to answer. My usual answer, I don't know. Maybe it's the reason is that we de facto think not by symbolic strings, but think by visual objects or what visual perception of the reality.
So that might I ask which 3 languages they are?
No, English, Russian, and Estonian.
Okay.
Actually, they happen to be very different languages.
Yes.
So
that's
structure.
So, first of all, it's known empirically that some people think much more in images than other people. So there are image thinkers and there are word thinkers. I guess you might be an image thinker. And I'm not sure whether this distinction is innate or whether you can learn to be an image thinker because that brings more benefits if you speak multiple languages. These are interesting questions, but unfortunately, I don't know the answers.
Yeah. Okay, and sorry about my second question is, you talked about the flow of commands from top to lower hierarchies. But in many cases, maybe not in the army, but let's say in the mission control, let's say moon mission control, it's very hard to build very strict hierarchical top-down command structure. And actually people are using models which they call federated control, which means some commands are given to a federation and federation itself by its own rules, maybe including sub hierarchical structure. But anyway, in this federated command structure, we cannot see very nice and control flow from top down and later on reconstruct from bottom to up again. So what do you think about that?
That's good. So this is a twin to the Lego question earlier. I think that the army, in order to make itself work, it's a huge organization, needs to err in the direction of Lego bricks and clean hierarchical chains of command. And the whole organization is based upon that structure. However, it knows that in particular wartime situations where things break down, that structure too is going to break down, and the troops are going to have to be trained to behave in the right sorts of ways, even when the command structure is no longer in operation. That's the first thing. But secondly, there are kinds of activities which do not work well in a strictly hierarchical chain of command kind of structure. This may be true of programming. It may be true of very, very creative planning. And so I'm sure, I don't know the details on this, but I'm sure that the army allows for let's say more innovative command structures where they are needed. So again, the basis is the Lego brick hierarchical command structure. I'm exaggerating a little bit now. The basis of everything is that. But then once you have that, you can experiment with more innovative kinds of command structure in specific contexts.